Thank you, Matthew. My name's John Barr, and I am going to speak about Lerone Bennett, and I am going to speak about Abraham Lincoln. This is a brief part of a book I hopefully will have coming out next year with LSU Press, and the title of the book is called Loathing Lincoln, An American Political Tradition, 1858 to 2012, and it's about his critics. And the book is premised on something that William F. Buckley once said, which was that you can't understand why Lincoln was loved if you don't understand why he was hated. In April 2003, 138 years after he had first visited the capital of the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln still haunted Richmond, Virginia. The occasion was the dedication of a sculpture depicting Lincoln and his son Tad seated on a bench outside Richmond's Tredegar Ironworks, engraved with the words, "To bind up the nation's wounds." The monument commemorated Lincoln's visit in April 1865, shortly after Confederates evacuated the city. That spring, as Lincoln walked through the streets, he was joyfully greeted by Richmond's African-American population, while Confederate residents remained in their homes, peering from behind their curtains. In 2003, it was evident that for some Americans, honoring Abraham Lincoln remained controversial indeed. The dedication ceremonies were picketed by several dozen protesters with signs comparing Lincoln to Adolf Hitler or demanding his indictment for war crimes. Overhead flew a plane with a banner displaying John Wilkes Booth's post-assassination cry, "Sic Semper Tyrannis." Bragg Balling, a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, thought the statue was a mark of insensitivity, a not-so-subtle reminder of who won the war and who will dictate our monuments, history, heroes, education, and culture. Why here? Balling asked. Yet post-war Cold War condemnations of Lincoln did not come solely from neo-Confederates or their libertarian allies. If Lincoln's self-confessed reactionary critics accused him of being a dictator, a war criminal, and the president responsible for centralizing power in the federal government, a much different and unmistakably negative assessment came from Lerone Bennett, Jr., an African-American historian who in painstaking detail advanced the argument that Lincoln was a timid, scheming politician who never wanted to free the slaves, but was instead forced into emancipation. The senior editor of Ebony magazine and author of a landmark 1968 essay entitled, "Was Abe Lincoln a White Supremacist?" Bennett answered in the affirmative. Bennett said Lincoln must be seen as the embodiment, not the transcendence of the American tradition, which is, as we all know, a racist tradition. In his inability to rise above that tradition, Lincoln, often called the noblest of all Americans, holds up a flawed mirror to the American soul. In short, if by 1865 the Civil War had become a contest over whether the question of whether American nationalism would remain based solely upon white male ethnicity, or if it would be based upon something larger and more inclusive, Bennett maintained that Lincoln was in the former camp, and it was time for Americans to drop the fiction that the so-called great emancipator belonged in the latter. Many were shocked by what Bennett wrote in 1968, and perhaps that an African-American had written it. 30 years later, the cause of diminishing Lincoln's stature with the American public was aided by Bennett's 600-page tome, Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. Bennett forcefully argued that your identity, whatever your color, is based, at least in part, on what you think about Lincoln, the Civil War, and slavery. In his view, this was vital, because Abraham Lincoln is not the light, because he is in fact hiding in the light, hiding our way. Forced into Glory elaborated in much greater depth and more strident rhetoric Bennett's central contention that the Emancipation Proclamation freed no slaves. Instead, the proclamation, I quote, enslaved and or continued the enslavement of 500,000 slaves, more slaves than it ever freed. Let's rephrase it and put it another way. On January the 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln re-enslaved and or condemned to extended slavery more blacks than he ever freed, end quote. Bennett therefore indicted the entire American historical profession for portraying Lincoln as an emancipator when he was actually an oppressor. Lincoln scholars had argued that the white supremacist statements Lincoln uttered and the colonization plans he pursued pandered to 19th century voters. But Bennett maintained that Lincoln's so-called great speeches hid his real agenda, to deport every black out of the United States and create a less pluralistic country, one exclusively for whites. The issue posed by all this is not the state of the soul of Abraham Lincoln, but the state of the soul of the Republic, Bennett declared, which finds its deepest moral values in a white supremacist who opposed integration and wanted to deport all blacks. One can say that the Republic has been unfortunately deluded by scholars who have systematically hidden the truth in one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of scholarship. Bennett thus shared with one characteristic with all of Lincoln's enemies, in that he presented himself as an intellectual pioneer, an iconoclast devoted to debunking truths suppressed by an allegedly nefarious Lincoln cult blind to the reality of their flawed idol. His numerous charges made more plausible neo-Confederate and libertarian accusations that the war was not fought over slavery or even Lincoln's real concern, but was instead waged, as both groups had argued for decades, to expand federal power over the states. Now, the idea that Lincoln was forced by events to emancipate the slaves was hardly original, nor was it shocking that a politician in a democracy might be influenced by public opinion to enact a policy he long favored. Indeed, in 1864, Lincoln said as much in a letter to Albert Hodges of Kentucky. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. What made Bennett's claim extraordinary was not simply that Lincoln was coerced into freeing the slaves, but that he was a hindrance to their emancipation. Lincoln was at best an incidental, accidental rider of a liberating wave that probably would have crested sooner and higher without him, Bennett contended. So if Lincoln did not want to free the slaves, or was forced to do so, then what he truly wanted was to colonize blacks outside the United States. Bennett maintained that Lincoln, like most 19th century Americans, did not subscribe to the idea of a multiracial nation, and if his policies had been fulfilled, the country would have remained racially exclusive. And here I quote, "For if Lincoln had been a strong and effective leader, there would be no blacks here, not even the blacks who say he was the strongest and best U.S. president. If Lincoln had succeeded, there would be no Broadway, no musical comedy, no American music, no Grammy and rock and roll, no Beatles or Gershwin or Copland or Fred Astaire, no American athletics to speak of, no Jim Brown or Michael Jordan or Dr. J, a thin white gruel of pale religion and food, and a constitution and a democracy lacking the ballast of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the singing summons of Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., Earl Warren, and Bill Clinton. An America, in short, without color, rhythm, and soul. Australia without a Mississippi River." Or Australia with a Mississippi River. Like all the president's detractors, Bennett thought Lincoln's presidency was the turning point in American history, not because he succeeded in winning the war or freed the slaves or centralized power in Washington, D.C., but for the reason that his white supremacist policies failed. From Bennett's standpoint, Lincoln was an indecisive leader morally indifferent to slavery and oppression. He was the archetype of the sensitive, suffering, ineffectual fence figure in America, in the Third Reich, in Algeria, in South Africa, who is born on a fence and lives and dies on a fence, unable to accept or reject the political evil that defines him objectively. Bennett claimed that Lincoln was in and of himself and in his objective being an oppressor, a conservative, when to be a conservative at a time of extreme oppression, as in South Africa, as in the Third Reich, as in the slave South, at a time when to be moderate is to be culpable and to be a conservative is to be an accomplice, is to be a different kind of person. Historians who defended Lincoln, or even tried to make his policies explicable, it followed, were no better than intellectuals in fascist Germany who joined the Nazi Party and defended Hitler's regime. Bennett held that, with rare exceptions, you can't believe what any major Lincoln scholar tells you about Abraham Lincoln and race. But what about the Confederacy? Many of Lincoln's conservative and libertarian enemies argued that the Confederacy was a morally sound cause. The words are philosopher Donald Livingston's, and that slavery's demise would have been hastened had the Confederacy won the war. Bennett, by contrast, had no patience with that argument. He observed that few modern scholars notice the similarities between the Third Reich and the Confederacy, and almost no one arraigns it or its leaders for crimes against humanity. Elsewhere, Bennett implied that Confederate President Jefferson Davis General Robert E. Lee and other high-ranking Confederates were war criminals who should have been severely punished after the conflict concluded. Nevertheless, Bennett associated Lincoln with the Confederacy because Lincoln was fighting for the old Union, for the Constitution as it was, with its slave clauses, for South Carolina as it was, with mint juleps, cotton and slaves, and for Illinois as it was, with black laws and a Constitution barring black settlers. Bennett's heroes were Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull and abolitionists, as Matthew noted, such as Wendell Phillips. And he was particularly hard on scholars who defended Lincoln by claiming that everybody in the 19th century was a white supremacist. He cited Phillips as a prominent example of a 19th century white American who was, unlike Lincoln, a racial egalitarian. Bennett believed it was no defense to say that Lincoln pandered to contemporary racist sentiment to get elected. Quote, "For a man who race baits in order to get elected and who supports man hunting, woman hunting, and children hunting because of his ambition has nothing to say to us, no matter how many historians sing his praises." Consequently, Bennett said, and here I quote, "Most major Lincoln scholars, comfortable, conservative, cautious white males, make themselves academic accomplices of the oppression and the slavery Lincoln supported." End quote. Notwithstanding Lincoln's private and public advocacy of limited suffrage for blacks, Bennett claimed that he remained to his dying day an unapologetic racist who wanted America cleansed of all African Americans. Yet he acknowledged that the president came tantalizingly close to embracing racial equality. Bennett quoted approvingly the section of the second inaugural address in which Lincoln resolved that if the war lasts until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the last shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Bennett characterized these lines as the one electric moment in the speech. But from this great rhetorical height, Lincoln descended to the valley, Bennett claimed, of racist policies by stating on April the 11th, 1865, the last speech of his life, his preference that the franchise was, quote, "conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers," end quote. From that day forward, John Wilkes Booth planned Lincoln's assassination in the hopes of reviving the Confederacy's fortunes, for uttering words Bennett argued proved Lincoln was a racist. Forced into glory struck a nerve in the Lincoln community and among the public at large. The former director of the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Jerry Prokopowicz, characterized the work as easily the most controversial Lincoln-related publication of this generation. And Prokopowicz thought that although it quoted Lincoln selectively and oversimplified the political context in which the president operated, it was a book with which all Americans will need to come to terms. Michael Lind, author of What Lincoln Believed, in 2004, said Bennett's book contained irrefutable scholarship. Yet two of America's most reputable scholars, Eric Foner and James McPherson, felt compelled to refute the irrefutable in reviews published in the Los Angeles Times and New York Times. Foner thought Bennett's book deserves attention, if for no other reason than it presents compelling evidence of how historians have consistently soft-pedaled Lincoln's racial views. Despite the volume's merits, however, Foner labeled Bennett's assertion that Lincoln was a supporter of slavery and an oppressor totally unfounded, and said Bennett is guilty of the same kind of one-dimensional reading of Lincoln's career as the historians he criticizes. McPherson agreed that Forced into Glory must be taken seriously, but while acknowledging that Lincoln did share the racial prejudices of his time and place and advocated the idea of colonizing blacks abroad, McPherson concluded that Bennett gets more wrong than he gets right, especially in his distortions in interpretation and distortion by omission. McPherson contended that if Lincoln was not hostile to slavery, as Bennett maintained, then it was impossible to understand why 7 slave states seceded in response to Lincoln's election. Finally, Bennett's idea that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed not a single slave is one McPherson said could not be more wrong. From January the 1st, 1863, freedom would march southward with the Union Army, which became, as Paul noted last night, an army of liberation. The overall effect of Bennett's work has nevertheless been significant, although perhaps not in the way many have believed. African-American historian Gerald Horne has described Bennett's popularity among blacks as, quote, stratospheric, while Lincoln biographer Alan Gelzo thought forced into glory symbolized one of the most dramatic transformations in American historical self-understanding in the past century, and that is the slow, almost unnoticed withdrawal of African Americans from what was once the great consensus of blacks' admiration for Abraham Lincoln. As Matthew just showed, that consensus had always been somewhat contested, but Gelzo was right that the president's prudential approach to emancipation, an approach that favored concrete results over pure motives as a criterion for successful policy, offered an important reason why some people, including Lerone Bennett, loathe Abraham Lincoln. Sadly, the work of all the president's critics in the post-Cold War era contributed to American cynical discontent with the political system Lincoln fought a war to preserve so that all should have an equal chance. It was impossible to claim, furthermore, that Bennett's work remained as shocking as it was in the 1960s, or that it was even necessarily representative of black opinion when one considered the pro-Lincoln comments of other African Americans. Thomas Sowell, an influential conservative economist with libertarian leanings at the Hoover Institution, reviewed Gelzo's The Emancipation Proclamation in 2005, dismayed there was even such a need for a volume like that. The book was necessary, and here the economist conceded the increasing influence of Lincoln's detractors, quote, because of the completely unrealistic view of the world, past and present, that prevails not only among the ignorant, but among the intelligentsia as well, end quote. Writing as if he had all Lincoln's adversaries in mind, Sowell declared that since the 1960s, it has been fashionable in some quarters to take cheap shots at Lincoln, asking such questions as, why didn't he free all the slaves? Why did he wait so long? How come the Emancipation Proclamation didn't just come right out and say that slavery was wrong? Sowell thought the people who indulge in this kind of self-righteous carping act as if Lincoln was someone who could do whatever he damn well pleased, without regard to the law, the Congress, the Supreme Court, still headed by Chief Justice Roger Taney. It was precisely for this reason that the proclamation was issued in uninspiring language, Sowell thought, for it was a military and legal document that applied specifically to slaves in territory controlled by enemy forces. Americans, Sowell believed, should be grateful for the president's leadership. Unfortunately, there were detractors who reduce other times, including our own, to cartoon-like simplicities that allow us to indulge in cheap self-righteousness when judging those who carry heavy responsibilities, end quote. Also in 2005, an African-American politician of a more liberal persuasion, Barack Obama from Illinois, published an essay in Time magazine honoring Lincoln's strengths while recognizing his limitations. Obama encapsulated why Lincoln's story continued to move Americans, yet at the same time, the future president of the United States unwittingly gave voice to Bennett's influence. Lincoln's rise from poor obscurity and his strength in the face of tragic loss were reminders, Obama said, of a larger fundamental element of American life, the enduring belief that we can constantly remake ourselves to fit our larger dreams. Nevertheless, as a law professor and civil rights lawyer, and as an African American, Senator Obama could not swallow whole the view of Lincoln as the great emancipator. He was cognizant of Lincoln's limited views on race and saw the Emancipation Proclamation as more a military document than a clarion call for justice. Obama's comments here were somewhat equivocal. Most Americans admired Lincoln's rise from poverty, and the Illinois senator's praise for the Emancipation Proclamation was tepid. Nevertheless, echoing the voice of W.E.B. Du Bois, Obama thought it was precisely those imperfections that made Lincoln so compelling. For when the time came to confront the greatest moral challenge this nation has ever faced, this all-too-human man did not pass the challenge on to future generations. Obama launched his presidential candidacy, moreover, from Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, and as President of the United States, he has been just as complimentary of Lincoln, averring at the 2009 Abraham Lincoln Association banquet that it's fair to say that the presidency of this singular figure, who we celebrate in so many ways, made my own story possible. The president's embrace of Lincoln signaled that a politically influential dissatisfaction with the 16th president emanating from the liberal wing of the political spectrum, a dissatisfaction that first emerged in the 20th century from the unfulfilled egalitarian promises of the Civil War and Reconstruction, was on the decline, if not dead altogether. So it is difficult to say where Bennett has been most influential. Certainly his arguments carried weight in the black community, but the drop in Lincoln's standing with African Americans was likely caused by other factors as well, including the overall loss of prestige among all political leaders in the post-Watergate and post-Vietnam era. And if the most prominent African American politician in American, if not world history, finds in Lincoln a positive, useful image, then the most significant impact of Bennett's work may reside outside the black community. Its illiberal, unintended effect, especially considering Bennett's comparison of the Confederacy to the Third Reich, was to give succor to Lincoln's neo-Confederate and libertarian opponents who claimed that Lincoln was the father of big government, a warmongering imperialist, a liar, probably a racist, who destroyed the Union, and that a nefarious professional Lincoln cult suppressed such unpalatable truths. These contemptuous portrayals of Lincoln have contributed to an atmosphere of public distrust in the United States, a vague sense that in the 1860s, Lincoln and the Union had been wrong and the South right, and that the nation's existence was somehow morally dubious. Such an outlook contributed to a deep cynicism toward the nation's government and made effective governance, at least at the federal level, less likely, if not impossible, to achieve. Those who believe freedom, equality, and federal power were inimical to each other embraced such an outcome, and their aversion to Lincoln intensified with the inauguration of the nation's first black president in 2009, coincidentally the 200-year anniversary of Lincoln's birthday. Bennett's critique also received greater attention, but was used by the president's conservative enemies to advance their decidedly negative portrait of Lincoln. For Bennett, whose writings indicated a belief that freedom and equality were inextricably linked and necessitated a strong federal government, and that because of a lack of consistent national commitment to racial equality, there had never been a true Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, such a result must have been bittersweet indeed. Thank you.